My name is Philip Martin, and I am the co owner of Philip Martin Gallery here in Los Angeles with my partner Portia Hine. And I hope you've had a chance to meet Portia either at the fairs or at the galleries. We're really happy to have you here today to talk with Daniel Dove about his exhibition, Slab Citizen, which is currently on view at the gallery. We just presented Daniel's work at Felix, and so this is a really nice opportunity for me. I'm very excited to talk to Daniel about this show, which includes both new paintings, significant new paintings, and a series of monumentally large paintings that I've admired for a long time, but I've never actually had the chance to show or see in person. And so we can have an opportunity, Daniel, perhaps to talk through the works. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for the intro and the invitation, Philip.
Awesome. Daniel, I love the show, obviously. It's super exciting. I was thinking about questions to ask you before we got started, and I realized that because I'm a narcissist, there's a number of questions I've never asked. Your paintings are incredibly complicated. They have personal resonance, they have pictorial resonance, they investigate place and people and ideas and the modern world. And I don't think I've ever really asked you, how do your paintings begin?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. They begin in this very, very informal way, which is just brainstorming kind of cartoonish drawings in a sketchbook, where I just sort of open myself up to anything that might seem to have some kind of resonance. And part of this is going back through just, many folders of photographs that I've accumulated just because they were provocative to me, but I had never utilized in a painting. That's a kind of stimulant. But then there's also just, drawing out of my head as a way of trying to come up with something that confirms its right to exist. So even if it's a very primitive sketch, you still have this moment of evidence where if you look at the sketch and then something sort of like tingles in your brain, you're like, okay, that's got a thing. You don't even have to quantify it or qualify it at that point. It's just that you know it when you see it. Um, and I keep sketching until I have something like that. And it, that can that's it can be, it can be 2 hours if I'm super lucky, or it can be, 2 weeks if things are not flowing naturally. But that's how things start.
So, are you working on multiple ideas at the same time? Like maybe you get started in one place and you say, there's something here, but I don't know where it's going to go. So, I'm going to maybe get started on something different and see how that works. Or is it more like you're like just following an idea through once you start?
It's always multiple things. And I think there's part of this, which is a condition of putting different ideas in competition with each other for your attention. Because if you only have one idea, if you only have one work that's cooking, it's automatically your best idea, no matter how good or bad it is. But if you have three, then there's the potential that three could be good or one or whatever, but they'll naturally start to arrange themselves in a kind of hierarchy of quality. And that's the only way I think that I can make a kind of judgment about how to move forward. Also, there's a way in which I need like an insurance policy. And what I mean by that is that if I'm getting into a sort of longer term painting, like a larger painting, I need to feel like there's an escape hatch because like I don't want to get into my natural tendency, which is what, masterpiece syndrome, where you're kind of like, this is it. This is going to be the painting. I need to develop another idea and get it to the point where it's almost ready to be made into a painting. So I have, almost like a way to imagine what's beyond the painting I'm working on.
Mm-hmm.
And that now that's not like sort of top-down intentional. I've just noticed that I do that every time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And so it sounds like it's an escape hatch. Is it also a way of maybe staying loose in the context of a painting that you are working on?
Um, I I'm not sure if anyone has ever um, attributed looseness to me in any fashion as a person. But yes, I think that it it allows me to feel like not all of the stakes are riding on one thing, right? And so if there's a need to pivot or reverse something, then the insurance policy allows me to, get a little less invested in a kind of strategic way in the thing I'm working on so I can actually, yeah, not be tight. So loose is the word in a psychological sense.
It sounds like, listening to your answer, there are aspects of loose that resonate, and there are aspects of loose that don't resonate.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk just a little bit? I think you've illuminated some notions of loose and how it does resonate and opens doors for you. Do you want to talk a little bit about the aspects of loose that maybe don't resonate for you?
Well, I think that I am a kind of hyper conscious person.
Mm-hmm.
And this extends across all of the domains of my personality. So I'm just very aware of how I'm interacting with people. I'm very aware of how my shirt fits. And and if I'm going to paint on a rectangle, and actually I had this conversation during the opening with a very insightful student who pointed out all of the tangent points, all of the places in the painting where form barely touched the edge of the support or barely touched another form. And
Mm-hmm.
you can see it right here on the left-hand side that it's all over that painting. And and you know, part of that is to assert flatness in a painting that might otherwise seem to have a kind of atmospheric or landscape space. And so if there's a highly self-conscious relationship to the support, then you're drawing attention to this physical object that's got a flat plane. So there's a kind of like, there's a kind of modernist pictorial concern there. But it's also just like I have to regard the edge with a kind of authority or a kind of like presence. It's in my brain. I'm very aware of it. So the way that I, regard it is I bounce ever so slightly off of it, which shows that it has a kind of, force in the picture, like where it kind of bounces, like the edge of the painting is almost like a solid form that then pushes a form that might intrude on it back. And so hyper consciousness, I think, is something that informs the way that how far I push my paintings in terms of their levels of development, how invested I get in the surface or technical aspects, and then also how I just organize form. I would say that that is not loose.
Are there other things that you might be able to, if we kept this going a little bit, what are maybe some other aspects of hyperconsciousness that you might see in your painting? Does it function in other ways?
Well, well, many, many years ago, you told me that a an art historian that we both had very high regard for, Richard Schiff, that his favorite artist was Zurbaran,
Mm-hmm.
and that the reason for that was that every part of the picture pointed back to the rest of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's both a very provocative goal, but also it's kind of hard to make sense of in any given picture. Like, what does that mean? It's not only compositional, it's not only conceptual, but there is a kind of organizing principle there where you hope that everything you do actually does more than one thing, you
Yeah.
know, whether that's sort of optical or conceptual. And that's a kind of hyper consciousness too, to sort of squeeze, all of the utility and quality and provocation out of every move that you're making. I'm not saying I get there. I'm just saying that that's like
Yeah.
that's the great state to strive for.
Well, we had a very nice kind of conversation after the opening with a man who was just really struck by your color and really struck by the care and really struck by seemingly so many of the questions that he might ask about a painting being answered in your work. He talked about coming up to an area and seeing that a line in a certain direction perhaps was being suggested to him, and then following that line and experiencing it kind of disappearing into space. Um, there's a lot of thought that's in there and a lot of technical skill. Um, did you have any thoughts in relationship to this particular conversation or to how a viewer who's looking at your work might have a certain kind of experience?
Well, first of all, I did kind of walk into that conversation, and I've got to say that the most resonant part of it for me was how genuine his affection
Mm-hmm.
for my work was. And I, like, yeah, like all people, I like ice cream and I like praise. But there's that part of it, but it was also the voice of someone who is a maker of paintings
Yeah,
expressing admiration at the level of like, we are in the same game. I know how hard this game is. Um, and so that kind of left me with this incredibly lovely taste in my mouth,
yeah,
being the last conversation of the
yeah,
opening.
yeah,
Um, I had in the painting that's right there on the right of the slide moving into the pool, I had two separate conversations during the evening, like 2 hours apart, with a person who pulled me over to the painting. They both insisted that I come over, and they both asked me this is exactly the same question, which is they were looking at the shadow part of the pool on the left-hand side.
yes,
And they both asked me exactly the same question, which is, what kind of transparent paint are you using in order to make that dark?
yes.
And I was a little confused by it, the question, or maybe taken sort of off guard by it because of how specific and technical it was.
And to
Even though,
clarify, I don't want to interrupt, but just
yeah,
to clarify, they're talking about this part or this part, just maybe.
it's all that part, but on the left-hand side in particular, they both pointed to the same part of it. Yeah, right there, right
Mhm.
there. And Um, so it's just interesting to be asked such a very specific, technical question. And, they say that whatever painters are doing in their work, whatever statements or concepts they're trying to form, they actually all really want to talk about process. And
Yeah,
at least for me, I find that that's really true. And so they would point to that part and say what kind of transparency you're using. And I had to stare at it really closely because it's been a little while since I've made that painting. But after staring at it closely, I realized there is no transparency in it. And I said this to the person, and they both looked at me with extreme skepticism. Like I was either confused or deceptive, right? And so there's something there. I don't know if they ended up believing me or not, but there's something there about trying to make a painting made in some kind of mysterious way, even the
yeah,
people who are invested in
yeah,
the actual making. And it's not certainly not the only or highest virtue of a painting, but it is something I strive for, and it's something that I really love when I look at other paintings where I just cannot pull them apart.
yeah.
You know,
Well, there's 2 points here to follow up with, and I don't know which one. Number one is the question of looking at things and maybe pulling them apart and that impulse. So let's just put that in the fridge for 1 second, just to clarify this transparency question, because I believe I spoke to one of these two people, and I believe what they told me is that you had um, grayed out the area and then gone back into it with color. Is that correct?
in functionally, yes. What happens is the so I'm painting this from observation, meaning that not that this pool exists, but that I had a model of it that I'd painted color patches in, and I put the model in the direct sunshine. So the color of this painting is observed from life.
Right.
And then I'd paint the pattern in based on, the drawings and the computer generated images I had. But after painting everything in, when it's all wet, I would scrape it all off, which
Yeah.
then sort of fused all the paint together and
Yeah.
created essentially a gray that is the
That's right.
midpoint. And then I reconstructed the pattern because it gets ruined when you do that. You reconstruct the pattern, but you still hold on to some of the randomized artifacts of the
Right.
scrape.
Right.
So functionally, yes, it's color that's emerging from neutrality that is emerging from the color.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's move on. Um, so I'm just going to keep the picking apart thing in the fridge because your comment reminded me of something today that seems oh so appropriate. We in the press release we used a well, okay. Maybe I'll just address it more directly because you just talked about having a structure and then scraping it down and then finding it again in the structure. And I read a fascinating little line in The Economist today about AI in India. And while I didn't finish the article, because I only got started, I believe the point they were going to make is that there would be a problem for Indian data centers to continue functioning because AI can come in and replace what they do because
Mm.
AI codes. And the point that they made in the article is they used two words I have never heard of because I do not do property development. But the two words were greenfield and brownfield. And I wondered if you knew either of these two terms. The point being that what they were saying, and they were using these, is that AI works very well in what's called a greenfield environment, meaning that you are beginning from nothing. But if you were working in a brownfield development, meaning that you have an existing form situation that you have to develop out of, that they would overtly say in property development, that's, don't try to build a brand new building in a brownfield, essentially. Um, but also, it's a problem for AI, which I think is fascinating. It doesn't work well in a brownfield arena either, meaning it can't work well with all the chaos of the existing system, all the entropy that it's running into, which is exactly what humans are really good at. So they were saying that there will be actually more work for Indian developers because they can work hand in hand with AI to help it understand how to deal with the jacked up brownfield. I feel like that resonates with what you just said about paintings.
Well, so to go back to the beginning of that, I have heard the term brownfield because I lived in Cleveland, Ohio for 5 years, and I don't think it's possible to live in Cleveland or a post-industrial city and
Yeah.
not have heard the term brownfield because there's always a brownfield that's being sort of addressed somewhere. And the way I understood it was something, a piece of land that had been used or exploited in industrial terms so much that it had essentially become a toxic zone.
Yes, right.
And it seems that the way that you're talking about it, or the economist was talking about it, was one that just has a lot of complicated pre-existing conditions in
Well,
it.
I had heard this before with regard to brownfield, but I hadn't realized that they had stretched the metaphor further to then have a new term, a greenfield, and then to be talked more broadly about what a brownfield might be.
Yeah, I think that in relationship to painting, and of course, every artist is different, but I do think that when it comes to me and my hyper consciousness and my, honestly, just love of naturalism in painting, the effects of light and shadow, the effects of atmospheric space, the tactile illusion of surfaces, that it's always helpful to me if I can create some kind of unplanned condition in some part of the work
Mm-hmm.
and then respond to that so that my work doesn't feel entirely like a kind of mere visual realization of what I have in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is what we would maybe call an illustrative function of painting, which is not to impugn illustration as a field,
Right.
these two words always get confused. The illustrative function of the painting would be to, sort of straightforwardly execute something that already exists in some other medium. And even though I think that probably most people would not say that they see that in my paintings, there is something about the most satisfying form where it's some kind of meeting point between my control and then a variable that comes out of the microstructure and structure of the surface of the support, or how hard you pressed on a scraper as you pull paint off. Um, and I think, yeah, I think I need that to have just some way. I function well when I have to sort of recover a form from being obliterated.
Mm-hmm.
Then I somehow feel like I'm going to have some influence from the somewhat chance-driven conditions of just the material,
Yeah.
uh, which opens up to a much larger conversation about paintings justifying their presence vis-a-vis materiality in a world that's going to be flooded with AI, fantastic AI images until the end of time.
Well, I was about to take you down the road of chance-driven process, but why don't you tell us just a little bit more about paintings justifying their materiality?
Well, I think that I've always been far too capable of being somewhat downbeat about painting's prospects, even though I've always been a lover of painting and
Mhm.
always devoted to it. But I think that, you look back in history and, the camera and how much it displaced about the journalistic function of painting.
Mhm.
That's just a complete wipeout. I mean, all you have to do is imagine a newscaster reporting on an event like a flood, and then next to them, an image, a painting of a flood comes up, and everyone's like, that's not a real thing. That's not true, right? And so the
Right.
truth value got displaced onto photography. And then photography became painting because of Photoshop and CGI. It became
Sure.
manipulatable at the most foundational level. And I gotta say, that freaked me out. I was like, that, photography is no longer, and never has been, I guess, but in a very available and much more profound way. It's not bound to there being a thing in the world that has to exist for it to index.
Mhm.
And I gotta say, like, I had this whole thing, like, well, is the domain of imaginative form slipping away from the grasp of painting,
Mhm.
given that kind of, fluidity of photography?
Mhm.
Um, this is the first time a technological innovation has made me more bullish about painting, and has made me feel like, the, you know, AI is going to become dominant no matter how much people, dislike it. It's just too easy and too spectacular in the way that it can do certain things. A lot of them are banal, but still, it does them very well.
Mhm.
Um, and that actually, what it turns out, what happens is that the more dominated we are by a kind of spectacular imagery, that are very suspicious as to whether a human was ever involved,
Mhm.
that we collectively long for evidence of a human presence.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's a wonderful time to be a painter or a ceramicist right now.
Dude, the conversational threads that I'm seeing, the doors we're having to walk by so quickly.
Right,
It's
right.
really
The lightning tour.
this is the lightning round here. It's
Yeah,
so challenging, very challenging.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to start. But one thing I'm going to say about AI is that it's pretty fascinating how. I think one thing AI is going to do is really show us how we think. I've been very surprised, like, look up a philosophy question on AI. Let's say you're noodling around and you're trying to figure out, like, what do these philosophers think? And you finally get to where you're like, okay, this is what Locke thinks. You could just go into AI and AI will be pretty accurate. Because it's cross-referencing and figuring out what that is. And so I think that's really interesting because it kind of takes away from, as you almost pointed out, our single focus on individual paintings, so to speak, our ideas, that this is our big idea. I'm going to figure out what Locke thinks, and now I'm going to be a genius. It's probably a good idea to have three
Right.
three of
Yeah.
those going
Yeah, yeah,
simultaneously.
yeah.
I think it also, I think very importantly, shows us how we think, which is really interesting. I'm sort of fascinated by this concept of the AI hallucination, and everyone's like, gosh, look at AI, it's having a hallucination. The real thing is, no, humans are having hallucinations all the time. And that's really what you see in a certain sense. Anything you want to respond to there, or do you desire to talk more about AI and painting?
Well, it's just funny that you bring up AI and philosophy, because there's a very, very niche genre of YouTube video where a person who's very trained in philosophy will torture AI with more and more absurd versions of like the trolley problem or other moral, and in a way they come up with this kind of ad hoc method of determining how sophisticated the LLM is
Right,
by how quickly it runs into contradictions
right.
based on these, really bizarre but still very interesting thought experiments.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, like if you have like, a certain number of LLMs tapping out past a certain point of complexity, that is people, and and then some people
It's only
trafficking in
people
seconds.
for now. Because, like, the in 5 years or 5 minutes or 5 weeks, that those LLMs are going to be on us pretty fast. You're going to have to be working pretty hard to torture them with the trolley problem.
I think everyone's getting a taste of the kind of a core sample of what happens when an artist and a gallerist have been talking to each other for decades. Because this is like every conversation just kind of spins out into the stratosphere, and we're just,
It did occur to me if we were reaching the point where this was no longer useful to the audience. Okay, no, we're gonna bring it back. We got some questions here. We have some dedicated listeners, and I think we can say everyone is having a good time and is in on this whole conversation. We're all here with us, with you, and with everybody. My then so let's bring it back. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I'm starting to suspect Daniel and I might talk for a while because theoretically we're done in 3 minutes, and I think we have a few more things to burn through if you desire to continue speaking with me. Um, let's go back to history painting then. Let's try that as a spot to get back to. And that is, you pointed out the conversation with photography with regard to painting. That brings up to me Delaroche after photography, painting is dead was essentially his point. We're talking France, mid 1800s, or possibly a little bit earlier, correct? Yeah, earlier, early 1800s, pre Courbet. And of course, that's very important because Courbet, to me, is in many senses the first modern artist. His growth as an artist happens exactly contiguous with modern media. He understands what painting can do in these other ways. And the point with painting, with regard to photography, in your example of the flood, is that, and that's what Delaroche is talking about, is that history painting is in some sense dead after photography. But what's really interesting is that even that history painting is not happening in real time. When somebody's like, okay, I'm going to make a painting of Austerlitz, they're doing that after the fact, and they're painting history. And what they're doing is they're crossing over with other paintings of history that maybe would have existed in the French Salon that period in the 1600s. And what a lot of those painters were doing in the late 1600s and early 1700s was painting Greek myths, painting Roman things, all kinds of different ways to talk about stuff in this kind of seemingly very slow conversation in regard to, say, how photography would show you a flood. Um, I believe that I will pause there, but all I would say is that the questions about AI, in many ways, are another way that technology works on painting. But then, the human desire to create is like a cockroach. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah, and I think that there's a tremendous amount of anxiety in creative professions across the board about the degree to which AI will intrude. And it is a question of how, uh, much the way that painting completely opened up a new set of adventures throughout the 20th century that were, so, irrelevant to photography and vice versa, that
Mm-hmm.
it it's photography is one of the elements that forced a kind of reinvention. Um, and I think that, a lot of artists are trying to figure out like what it is how do they respond? How do they carve out a kind of continued necessity for what they do? And in a highly inefficient, singular, one of a kind, human brain did it
Yeah.
way. Um, and like I was saying, this is the first time that I feel like there's something native to painting, and I always include ceramics here,
Yep.
about hand fabrication over every square inch of a thing.
Yeah.
Um, that there's something about that that actually, by virtue of the introduction of a piece of technology, just became more valuable like overnight. Like it
Yeah.
didn't even need to respond in a particular way. I do think that it's interesting to think about pushing forward all the different ways that whatever is overtly, the index of a person, and who knows, maybe this gives rise to a kind of reinvention of abstract expressionism.
Yes.
Um, because talk about like, the presence of a human body in front of a
Yep.
singular object.
Yep.
Now, I say all this while also in my paintings being highly indebted to photography and, making images that are what, they don't go all in for only human index, right? They're trying to do these other things too. And I think that some of them might be overlapping with what you know, an intelligent image, automated image producer could create. But the whole idea is that what one is doing can never be subsumed by that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
so yeah,
no. Yes.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would just say, shame on you for having any contradictions. Um, how human of you. And I think, thank God, phone a friend. Our audience has come through. Our Zen master here says, perhaps much of painting is about being wrong, which AI has a problem with.
Well, and the question of right or wrong in a painting, in terms of correct or incorrect, it's like, painting just runs orthogonally to that. Once it's, decoupled from its truth condition vis-a-vis photography, then the rightness or wrongness of a painting is like this highly subjective, very sensation-based call that a person's making. And I think that just means something completely different in AI, because if AI gets something wrong, then the business you built based on that piece of software that AI vibe coded collapses, right? So it just seems like there's a kind of like binary, set stakes in terms of accuracy in relationship to AI, whereas painting or any art form is exploring wrongness. Well, we can just take bad taste, for example. How many great pieces of art get made from a starting point of bad taste or corrupted taste?
Mm-hmm.
We've got a lot of feelings about wrong things as humans, and so yes, I think that's a very interesting comment.
Yeah, no, I think that my next question would be, would we like to return to maybe discussing your move to Cleveland from Austin? Because we have not discussed any aspect of the subject matter of the painting so far. Would you like to talk about how your paintings begin in terms of subject matter?
Well, Cleveland had a tremendous effect on me, and I moved to Cleveland for my first full-time academic job at the Cleveland Institute of Art. And I'd never been to Ohio before that, and so I had no idea what it was. Having grown up in Austin, which is had there was a minute when it was like a sort of sleepy, undiscovered, you know, liberal mecca in the middle of Texas, and then it just became a perpetual growth story
Yep.
that continues to this day. I just didn't know what it was like to move to live in a place that was defined by being in the aftermath of its greatness,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to always hurtling toward it. And no offense to anyone, any Cleveland or Ohio in the chat.
Yeah.
Ohio is very diverse too. Columbus doesn't feel this way. Um, and I think that I really connected to that sense of there being something, deeply melancholic about something having been, born of a tremendous optimism and success,
Yeah.
but then being abandoned because of, some kind of macro shift where
Yeah.
this is just a complete collateral damage.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about literally a building that no one takes care of anymore. And then it starts to degrade at
Mm-hmm.
its surface because Cleveland weather is very hard on structures. And then it becomes far more, talk about entropy, it becomes a far more organic kind of structure because no one is maintaining its surface,
Right.
which then yields this effect of, I would say, exaggerated tactility, which to me brings you right back to painting.
Yes.
and it took me a while to discover that I felt like Cleveland had a very deep relationship. I mean, through the eyes of a painter, Cleveland was a city that you could paint in a
Hmm.
way that, Austin or San Luis Obispo, in which I've also lived, it just didn't lend itself to me in
Yeah,
this, you know. So
that's
it was,
interesting.
yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, what you're talking about, and I'm from Indiana, and my sister used to live in Mishawaka, which is outside of South Bend, where they had the Ball rubber factory, and the upper Midwest is a very specific thing. And of course, Cleveland, like Toledo, we're talking about glass, tires, automobiles, all the things of America in the late 1800s, but early 1900s. The Toledo Museum of Art, a lot of those museums are from the early 1900s, as opposed to somewhere like Cincinnati, which is from the 1840s, their museum, and that's because of those cities growing during that time and putting up public sculpture, which is a big part of what you're doing. Of course, the public sculptures came later, but building amazing museums, doing all these things. Entropy is about, basically, with entropy, you're putting energy into a closed system, and if you're not continuing to put energy into a closed system, then you're going to have entropic effects. And so that's to some degree what you're describing in terms of Cleveland, is this feeling of intense energy then making way for all these new combinative effects, because there's simply more things for things to combine into than there are for them to stay in some situation forever, which is very difficult for humans to understand.
Yeah, the tremendous amount of energy that goes into putting up, huge industrial structures, and then the tremendous amount of energy that's, used in utilizing those structures to produce, automobiles, for example, or any of the things that you named.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then to have first all of that productive energy leave and get offshored,
Mm-hmm.
and then to have whatever energy that's implicit in the upright structure, you put a wall upright, it's got all this potential energy built into it now because it releases the energy when it falls. So you start having this very slow release of energy that's actually stored in the building itself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Cleveland, like the weather was a little torturous, like overcast all the time, sort of ruined my Texas brain. But yeah, like I said, I feel like it's just had a tremendous impact on my work and
Yeah.
probably will until the end of my days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think with Austin, what I would point out is that Austin, though, too, this is starting to happen. It's very interesting how you're starting to get nooks and crannies and eddies in Austin where, because there's a real homeless issue in Austin. Austin there's absolutely entropic things happening there. I mean, talk about a green field. It was this green field, but then, now when you drive in from the new airport and all that stuff, seeing what that airport did and all those things, like you look out that window and Austin is aging in its own way for those of us who have been going there for 30 some odd years.
Yeah, I
Um,
visit every year, so I see what you speak.
Yes. You mentioned the word you used was tactility.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk? Could you talk just a little bit when you say, Cleveland was a place you could paint or seeing a certain kind of tactility? And this is Cranbrook, and I assume that this is the design storage area at the museum at Cranbrook. What did you mean by that word, kind of tactility, in terms of your own paintings and making paintings?
I mean, at the most basic layer, it's just a presence of human touch on the surface of the painting, and a kind of illusion of what it would feel like to touch the subject matter that is depicted in the painting.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a dual thing that's happening at base layer. I think that for me in my paintings, I'm attracted to the idea that they feel painterly, but they don't have like literal brushstrokes in them.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I mentioned earlier, that the material conditions cannot be pulled apart.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, so. and I can't fully or even partially account for why I like that thing about painterly but no brushstrokes. Because when someone has a glorious brushstroke in a painting, I'm like, I'm there for it. You
Yes.
know, I'm there for the Joan Mitchell and the Alice Neal.
Yeah.
I just kind of felt like I never quite knew what to do with the kind of gestural energy embedded in a brushstroke.
Yep.
And so I kind of had to push away from the sort of the sort of lack of engagement that I just by my nature have with that component of it, to the point where it became an irrelevant aspect of the work, whereas the physicality of the medium still hopefully is very relevant. And it's always one of the most gratifying things I hear is that people tell me that the paintings are better in person than they are in reproduction, and I'm just always happy to hear that.
Yeah. Well, your point reminds me of a comment made by Ewan Uglow, the British painter, who commented at one point that a big, I don't know if I'm overblowing it, but I was just very struck. He said he didn't want his paintings to be too wristy. And that just has really stuck with me as a very interesting thing to have in your generational core.
Yeah, is it fair to say that it gets too risque? If it's too much wrist. And I guess what he was meaning is sort of like every mark being sort of this pivot as opposed to this
I
pivot.
don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I think he was. I don't know. It's stuck with me. This painting is called Cigarette, and I believe it relates to a painting that's to a Tony Smith sculpture that's at the Albright Knox in Buffalo.
That's correct. In this version, I added an extra leg in order to so the Tony Smith sculpture terminates on the lower right side.
Mm-hmm.
That vertical leg terminates when it hits the ground, but
Mm-hmm.
I added another leg to it so there can be a kind of like spiraling inward of
Mm-hmm.
the form.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I also painted this in large part from a physical model that is so abject when you look at it that it's laughable. One of my dear friends is a sculptor, and I said, "Hey, do you think you could whip me up a version of this Tony Smith sculpture so I can use it as a prop?" And she was like, "Oh, of course." And then it turned out that actually it was just totally beguiling thing to try to figure out in planar terms. And I'm like, wow, there it is. I'm never going to look at a Tony Smith in the same way. I'm never going to
Yeah.
think of it as simple. I'll think
Yeah.
of it as reductive, but never simple.
Yeah.
But she figured it out, and so I
Right.
have this like I still have it somewhere. It broke like four times. So it was that model, and it was set up in front of a curved piece of like a poster board that had little mirror tiles from Michaels glued to it. It's one of the worst models I've ever worked from.
That is
Um,
hilarious.
yeah,
Well, it explains something because when I look at it, I had always, for whatever reason, I had always assumed this was the cam in Houston. I don't know if the cam in Houston has reflective tiles, but for some reason, I kind of always imagined it was in the cam sculpture garden. I mean, I don't know why I thought that. So that's funny to realize that it's an abject combination of you torturing a fellow artist and Michael's. Um, this painting, I just have to say, like the color change here, I really hope people do have a chance to come to the show because it's really a fantastic painting. And I think your point too about seeing things in person and really taking the time to put your mind into them. I mean, the Tony Smith smoke sculpture that LACMA got is just like you get inside that thing, especially in the old installation, and that thing would like you thought you knew what was going on, but it was very once you got into it, it was like challenging. Okay, so we talked about this painting. I'd like to point out we're getting towards the end too, Daniel. I think this might be our last image. I don't know if there's anything that you might like to talk about we haven't talked about thus far. I would point out this is called Linsfarn, which is the monastery that was looted by the Vikings to begin the kind of Viking conquest of the UK. And of course, we've now seen it in any number of highly roided out TV programs. Um, why did you choose that title and anything you might like to say that we haven't covered so far?
Well, the pattern that's in the pool is derived from a
Uh,
illuminated manuscript.
from the Book of Kells?
Yeah.
Dude. That's the kind of shit you pull. What the F?
I'll take that as a compliment,
You
Philip.
should.
Yeah.
You should. People, we should be complimenting this man. That's hilarious. It's yeah. Now I'm starting to wonder. My mom would be up in my grill if because the Book of Kells also was in Iona. I don't remember. Anyway, we'll just drop it. Anything you want to say we just hang up on you?
Well, I want to say two things. First, about this painting
Yeah.
was it's just as simple as noticing that those undulations of the lines and the colors in medieval manuscripts had some kind of relationship to graffiti that
Yeah.
tends to adorn these abandoned pools.
Totally.
And I got to say that I'm no more accountable for anything beyond that point other than to notice that and think there might be an idea there.
Yeah.
And so, shout out to all the intuitive artists who are just following their nose into
Yeah.
something without a proper justification for it.
Yeah.
Um, and then the second thing I want to say is that just in general about the show is that I made some of these older paintings, the larger paintings that are in the second room during a time in my life when I didn't have gallery representation and I was working in my garage in San Luis Obispo, and I I was, there was just a very long lost period of making a painting, working on it for months, and then putting it into a storage rack, right?
Yeah.
And to walk into that back room and see them find a piece of public wall was just more moving to me than I thought it would be. So
Ah.
I really want to thank you for including those works in the show.
Yeah, well, it's really a pleasure to show them. And I think that in this conversation, you have made some really interesting points that I think have been really great for people that, just to realize, as I say, that I never really asked you how your paintings began. And just to hear you kind of go through this process that's really exciting. That was really a pleasure. And I think your point with regard to people that, you know, opening doors and figuring things out. And, there have been some themes here about, intention versus chance and looseness versus hyper awareness and entropy. I mean, of course, the pool to me is always famous for Dogtown and Z Boys, where they make this point that there was a drought and all the pools were empty, and voila, here comes skateboarding in its modern iteration, which is incredible. And I think maybe that's part of this painting in some sense, talking about entropy, but beyond an AI, but beyond it all, just this feeling about you know the artistic creative act and going out and doing it, and maybe sometimes knowing where you're going, and sometimes maybe being surprised.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know, you know that's my thing. And so before I bring Bonzo out, is there anything else left that you want to say?
I just want to thank everyone who showed up for this webinar, to hear a conversation. It's no guarantee with these mute objects that any conversation will ever happen, but Philip always makes sure that that is taken care of in his program. So,
That's very kind. Well, everybody, I hope that you enjoyed yourselves. I hope you have a great weekend. I hope everyone is safe. It's become a little bit of a mantra for this. It's just the world is a nutty place. If you're in around, please come see the show. We just opened it. It's up. And if you have any questions, just send me an email or check in. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. It's just an honor to show your work, and I love working with you.
thanks, Philip.
Take care.